Ladies and gentlemen, please stand to your feet. The 47th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
2 months before Donald Trump is back to the White House, and calculations are already being made on how his return as the 47th American president is going to impact the Middle East. Some experts say that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are two sides of the same coin when it comes to regional issues. But for the most part, Palestinians in Gaza say they are not optimistic about the new administration, and some are worried that things might actually get worse for them. Their concerns are rooted, of course, in decisions Donald Trump made during his first term as president when he moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, cut $200 million in funding to the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, and called himself, quote, history's most pro-Israel U.S. president. In 2020, then-President Trump revealed his peace plan for the Middle East, titled Peace to Prosperity, which proposed his vision to both a political and an economic solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. But the plan had been strongly rejected by the Palestinians, not only because it was drawn up without their input, but also for revoking important rights for Palestinians and what they saw as prioritizing Israeli interests. While the deal did make way for a future Palestinian state, Trump's plan set conditions that were difficult to accept for the Palestinians. Under the plan, Palestine would remain fully demilitarized. It would sacrifice any main part of Jerusalem as its capital, and crucially, refugees would lose their internationally recognized right to return. Another contested point was the annexation of illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank into Israeli territory. But the political landscape in the Middle East is drastically different from what it was 4 years ago, even different from just a year ago. Donald Trump, with his America First policy and business-minded approach to governance, has now a lot of factors to consider. Tensions between the US and Iran continue to escalate, while Iran's relationship with Arab states has improved. Israel's wars in Gaza and Lebanon are becoming more and more costly to bankroll for the US, and Trump's pulling out of US troops in the region stands challenged after Joe Biden sent more destroyers to the region and THAAD anti-missile systems with operators to Israel. All this while the world is more strongly advocating for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza ahead of political considerations. Meanwhile, Qatar, a key mediator in the ceasefire talks, has recently said it's withdrawing from its role until the warring parties act in, quote, good faith. And media reports suggest that Hamas's political leadership may even be expelled from Doha. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we analyze what a Trump presidency could mean for Palestinians in the short run and in the long term. Will Trump deliver any respite to them after 14 months of war? Will his policies from his first term change? Will there be any future of peace and security in Palestine, Israel, and the Middle East? And could his transactional approach actually prove beneficial? It's only been 4 years since Trump was president. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza will not be quick to forget the impact of his policies. But after a painful year of war during Biden's term, what do they make of the incoming president-elect? I spoke about this with Dr. Dalal Iriqat on the sidelines of the Abu Dhabi strategic debate. She is an associate professor of diplomacy at the Arab American University in Palestine.
Donald Trump, in his first term as president, took a lot of actions unilaterally that had detrimental effects and impacts on Palestinians. Can you tell us what these are and how they actually reflected on the ground for the ordinary Palestinian? And what do we expect will happen this time around, given how much has changed in the region?
For a Palestinian who had witnessed the Trump's term and the imposed facts on our grounds, and we need to mention, his recognition of Jerusalem as a capital for Israel, his closing of the American consulate, which was established in 1844, his removal of the designation of the term occupied on the Golan, and on the whole terminology had changed under Trump. It was all also not only unilateral in terms of the illegality, but it also came in violation of the peace agreements which were signed between the two sides to start with, but it also violated all the UN resolutions that had safeguarded the Palestinians' rights on Jerusalem, on the West Bank, on the 67 borderline. The good news, if we want to compare with the Biden administration, is that this past year alone had shown us how the US Biden administration had shielded the Israeli war crimes. Diplomatically, legally at the UN, they had provided all the military might, all the financial support, the strategic support to go ahead with the ongoing genocide. I'm not saying that Trump will not support Israel. He will. But he will at least not sugarcoat what he does. He is blunt, he is direct, he violates all laws, it's true. He violates the basic understanding of the international world-based order. Yet we understand he's pragmatic, he calls himself a deal maker. And he had said repetitively that he wants to stop the war, which is something we welcome, of course. And now for the Palestinians, I would say we need to adopt a more pragmatic approach in dealing with the new American administration. We should learn from our past experience with the Trump administration, where the PLO had decided to boycott basically the American administration, hoping that justice shall prevail, that international law will prevail. Yet, in reality, 4 years later, and after the Biden administration's different promises, on the ground, nothing was reversed. More settler colonies and more settler colonialism is being practiced on the Palestinian land. Netanyahu and his entourage, as Smotrich, Ben Gvir, like officials in Israel, are working not only de facto annexing the Palestinian land, but they dare to make it de jure. They dare to take many settler colonial practices to the Knesset. We saw how Smotrich yesterday bluntly spoke about the annexation of what he called, quote unquote, Judea and Samaria. And he actually stressed that the coming back of Trump is carte blanche for the annexation of the West Bank.
What do Palestinians inside the West Bank think about a Trump presidency? We spoke to Gazans, basically, inside Gaza, about what they thought. And they thought it's not going to make a difference. Some of them said it might make things worse. So what do Palestinians in the West Bank think?
You know, if you talk to any Palestinian after this specific year, we're still going through a genocide against the Palestinian people, and the war crimes were documented. That 70% of the souls perishing are amongst women and children. So the traumas and the sufferings which came under the Biden administration are not to be tolerated by anybody. So when you ask any Palestinian about what they think of the Trump administration now, they cannot give you an answer in disregard of the Biden administration. Because we had witnessed how this Democratic administration that had promised us to reopen the consulate. Blinken himself, he came after the re-election and he promised that he would reopen the PLO offices in Washington, for example. The resumption of the American-Palestinian bilateral relations to resume as normal. They had made so many promises. They spoke bluntly in very civilized language of prosperity for the two people, for peace and security, and for equal measures. That was the rhetoric of the Biden administration, equal measures. And what did we witness in reality? Total shielding of Israel, total impunity enjoyed by Israel with the support of the American military strategy and finance. So that's why some Palestinians would be okay with the re-election of Trump, because they wanted for the Biden administration to learn their lesson, the Democrats to learn a lesson. Yet, every Palestinian, it's been only 4 years, so we did not get to forget the daunting reality that Trump had brought into our land. It doesn't take a genius to just guess that he will take things to the extreme and he might support fanatics like Smotrich in Israel. Yet, I still think there is an opportunity, not because he sees the sufferings and the rights of the Palestinian people, but because he is very much pragmatic and an interest-inspired person, and he has interests in the region.
Do you think a Trump administration will be more staunchly against Hamas and refuse to accept Hamas as a part of any potential Palestinian government? And as much as we like to say that a Palestinian government is an internal issue and is an internally Palestinian decision that needs to be made by Palestinians, the fact of the matter is that there are international actors that do, as you said, play a role in pressuring, and they have a say, and their say is considered. Do you think that a Trump administration is going to have an impact on that?
When we go back to the Palestinian politics, yes, unfortunately, many players, regional or international, do play a great role in the formation of our politics. If we go back to the question of Hamas, inspired by the different experiences in recent history, where conflicts were resolved through peaceful means, talking about Northern Ireland, for example, the world leaders today need to be inspired by that model. Because unless you engage everybody, unless you make sure that all parties, including those with military wings, are at the table, then, and if we continue to sideline them, they will unfortunately spoil any agreement in the future. So if the Trump administration and the Palestinians and the regional powers are really serious about a strategic peace and security for the Middle East and the deal of the century that he's speaking about, then from an academic perspective, I think nobody should be sidelined. They will definitely be the spoilers of any agreement unless they are part of that deal.
Do you think the deal of the century is going to come back?
Definitely. But we'll have a season 2, deal of the century, if I may say. Because the guy is very individualistic, of course. He believes in his powers and he believes that he's superior in his creativity and what he can bring to this world. However, I think that there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity if we all engage on a pragmatic level, inspired by a win-win scenario. However, when all parties are involved, when all parties share their interests, when the Palestinians are treated as a primary party to this conflict, the Palestinians need to be included, and where the Saudi international coalition will definitely have its own impact. And everybody now is very much focused on the recognition of the Palestinian state with the hundred countries in support. Yet, I need to warn everybody that what we need to reach peace and security is really to end the Israeli military occupation, to define the border of the state of Israel, and then speak about the recognition of the Palestinian state. Because our matter as Palestinians is not really the recognition per se, but the sovereign state of the Palestinians, the non-dependency of that state.
Over the next 2 months, all eyes will be waiting to see if and how a Trump administration will finally bring an end to the war in Gaza. And beyond that, what approach the incoming president is going to take regarding the quote, day after. And what about the long haul? And how different will Trump's policies be from his first term? I put these questions to Gaith Al-Amari, senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He was also a former member of the Palestinian Authority. Gaith, in his first term as president, Donald Trump moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and brokered the Peace to Prosperity Plan, which Palestinians largely rejected at the time, criticizing it for facilitating the annexation of its territories and ignoring many of the rights that Palestinians want to have. How are Palestinians reacting to his re-election this time around, and is there an expectation that this time will be any different?
It's worth noting that this new Trump administration is coming in a radically different regional environment. During that time, the Palestinian issue was marginal, frankly, very little interest, whether in the region or in the world or in the United States. It's coming at a time where the region is very unstable because of events triggered by the Gaza war. I think there's a regional desire to resolve the conflict. That's one. Two, I think the Palestinian Authority in particular, and the Palestinian people in general, were very frustrated with the Biden administration. And I think there's, at least within the Palestinian Authority, maybe some hope that the Trump administration will be different. First of all, Trump has repeatedly called for a quick wrap-up of the war in Gaza. What I hear is that they want it basically off the radar by January 20th. Trump does not want to start his term dealing with a war in Gaza. And two, what we've been hearing for the last couple of days is that people close to Trump are saying to the Israelis, wait a minute, we're not going to be supporting annexation. If we support any annexation, it has to be in the context of a peace deal. I think this created openings for the Palestinian Authority to engage with the Trump administration, and they spoke already with some of his aides in recent weeks.
Can you elaborate on that second part about annexation, please?
Some Israeli politicians, particularly Finance Minister Smotrich and Police Minister, National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, were quick to say after Trump won, okay, this is our time, this is our chance to annex. The last couple of days, we heard from a couple of Trump aides, including Jason Greenblatt, who was part of the Trump administration in the first time, basically saying that the U.S. might support some annexation, but only in the context of a peace deal. The Trump administration presented its peace plan back in the first term, and it was not only the Palestinians who rejected it. It's worth noting. It was also the Israeli far right who rejected it, because the Trump plan does include a Palestinian state. Yes, not one that lives up to the expectations of the Palestinians, but a Palestinian state nevertheless, which was very strongly opposed by the Israeli right. So once the Israeli politicians said this, the Americans were saying, wait a minute, this is not a carte blanche. You have to pay a certain price if you want to annex certain territories. What that means in reality, too early to tell, but clearly they're basically dampening the excitement, as it were, of the Israeli far right.
Do you think that Trump is going to be worse than Biden for the Palestinians, given all the unilateral actions he took during his time as president?
We do know that he is not going to be bound by the traditional concepts that we had when it comes to kind of big diplomacy. His idea of a two-state solution is very different from the traditional idea of a two-state solution. And if the first term is a guide, then certainly his plan cannot be accepted by the Palestinians, mainly because it entails the annexation of all settlements, making a Palestinian state not viable. But on Gaza, I would argue that he will be a stronger president in terms of pushing for an end of the war. What would be very, very interesting, and this remains to be seen, is whether or not he will revive the idea of regional integration, Abraham Accords 2.0. And this time, I think, again, the context is different. The Saudis have been very clear. There will be no normalization with Israel without concrete, credible steps towards a two-state solution and a commitment to a two-state solution. Trump, at the end of the day, is transactional. He wants to get a deal. And if he feels that this is a firm Saudi position, and I believe it's a firm Saudi position, then he will pressure the Israelis to accept it.
The Palestinian Authority has scrambled together and reshuffled the government earlier this year to a technocratic one. But will there be a need to do that again when we're discussing post-war Gaza? And what do you make of the current condition that the Palestinian Authority is in today regarding its global standing?
I mean, the Palestinian Authority has never been weaker than it is now since its creation. It's weak when it comes to the Palestinian public. I mean, just look at opinion polls and you will see how unpopular it is, how a significant majority of Palestinians believe it's a liability rather than an asset. And it's weak globally. I mean, it has basically been missing in action since the Gaza war. It has played no role. Who is leading the international effort? It's other Arab countries, whether the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians. So the PA has been completely absent. And again, if you look on the ground in the West Bank, it's been ineffective. Now, if you talk about Gaza, I think, and this is where we hear from Arab countries, who are basically saying that they are willing to come in, and they will only come into Gaza under the invitation of the Palestinian Authority. However, there is such frustration with the corruption, with the inefficiency of the Palestinian Authority that I just don't see the Palestinian Authority being, in its current form, being able to run Gaza. The more likely scenario is for the Palestinian Authority to create a Gaza Authority under the at least symbolic control of the Palestinian Authority right now. But this Gaza Authority will actually be largely independent, funded, supported, and even not only supported financially, but even with personnel, etc., from outside. Yes, the current PA government is more effective than the previous PA government, but honestly, when I talk to officials, whether in the Arab world or in Europe or in the United States, they're not that impressed with it. They say it's better, but it has not yet met the standards, and it's not only a question of skill and capability. Frankly, it's a political question. The PA is unpopular. President Abbas is highly unpopular. And yes, the current prime minister is extremely effective and professional, yet without a political reshuffle, not only a technocratic one, the PA will continue to suffer from credibility problems.
Under the Trump administration, Ghaith, what role do you feel that Hamas is going to play, if at all, in a future Palestinian government and, more importantly, in the governance of Gaza?
It is not only the Americans who will not accept a role for Hamas in Gaza. This is the same in Europe. We should not forget that Hamas is designated terror organization in Europe. But most importantly, I would argue, in most of the Arab world, they will not accept a role for Hamas in the day after Gaza. Most Arab officials that I speak to, actually all Arab officials that I have spoken to, have been very clear in terms of the way they looked at October 7th as a highly irresponsible, even criminal act from Hamas. The implications for Hamas's action on October 7th and what followed has harmed not only the Palestinians, it also has harmed Arab interests. The question, though, is in practical terms, yes, of course, there will be no political role for Hamas. That's obvious. There will be no Hamas ministers or deputy ministers in any future one. But the challenge actually is, what do you do with the low-level employees in the Gaza governance structures? And here, when at least in Washington, when we talk about this, we always think of the de-Baathification that the U.S. did in Iraq. When the U.S. took over Iraq, anyone who was a member of the Ba'ath Party basically was not allowed any role in the future. And that created a vacuum that ultimately allowed for terror organizations to emerge. So there might be a role for some of these low-level ones who are not active in the Hamas military wing, etc. But politically speaking, no one, not the Israelis, not the Americans, not the Europeans, and not the Arabs will accept a political role for Hamas.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines. Visit thenationalnews.com for more of our reporting on the outcome of the US election and its impact on the Middle East. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor. And I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.